said, today's the octave of Easter, which liturgically means we're still celebrating Easter Day. And part of that celebration is this feast of Divine Mercy. And this year, something caught my attention. It's a word used in the opening prayer of the chaplet of Divine Mercy. You expired, Jesus, but the source of life gushed forth for souls, and the ocean of mercy opened up for the whole world. O fount of life, unfathomable divine mercy. We know that word unfathomable as to mean ununderstandable, or we can't get to the depths of it. But the word ocean with unfathomable caught me. As I researched the etymology of fathom, it's in fact, it comes a little bit from the Dutch, from the German, this, that. The German word eventually, faden, has the sense of grasping something, arms wide out. And faden came to mean 6 feet. A grown man's arms raised out, it's roughly 6 feet from one end to the other. And it's a little more than that, but roughly that's what it is. And fathom is a nautical term. And the way they would, early sailors would measure how deep the water they were in, would tie off a knot every 6 feet in the on a rope. And actually, you can kind of see them. If you got the end of a rope and you go like this, and you tie a knot, and take there, you go like this, tie another knot. You can see how you'd have these knots every 6 feet or so. You would tie a lead weight on the end of a rope. The sailor would stand out. A lot of ships had a little outrigging there. And they would swing this thing and throw it out in front of the bow of the ship. And by the time the ship came abreast of it, they could see how deep it is. The lead would sink. They especially used it going in and out of ports or bays or something so they wouldn't drown. So they'd be 3 fathoms deep, 6 fathoms deep or something wide. And of course, in the deep ocean back then, the water would have been unfathomable. They wouldn't have enough rope to be able to measure, right? So the deep ocean would be unmeasurable. And there are 2 ways that something could be unfathomable, and that's the first way. That you don't have the technique or the technology or the ability, whatever, to measure something. Of course, what was unfathomable to early sailors is now fathomable. The sonar, whatever, we can measure the depth of even the deepest part of the ocean. The second way, and in that first way, of course, God's mercy is unfathomable to us. We're not divine. We're not infinite. And so with our limited human capacity, we cannot begin to fathom God's mercy. We can't measure or understand the fullness of God's infinite mercy. But to be honest with you, that's not so interesting to me. Just the fact that we are incapable, being finite, of understanding something. If I played a game of one-on-one with Michael Jordan and he beat me, Nobody would get all that excited about it. Well, of course. Stef isn't as good a basketball player. Or if I played a round of golf with Tiger Woods, he somehow managed to score lower than I. Nobody would be all that interested in that, right? Okay, big deal. Stef's a lousy golfer. But the second way in which something is unfathomable is if it is in and of itself unmeasurable. And so that's the second way, and much more interesting, you might say, because God's mercy is as profound as God is. No words we can actually use. Unfathomable, unmeasurable, ununderstandable are really probably the best words we can find for God's mercy. God's mercy never ends. There is no measurability to it. And if we read the gospel today in that context, we can see something of that. Jesus comes to earth. It's an outpouring of God's mercy. He suffers and dies for us. More mercy outpouring. He's raised. And then he comes to the upper room on that morning. And imagine yourself as one of the apostles who ran away and left Jesus in the lurch, left him to face his arrest by himself. Or even worse, Peter, who denied him 3 times. Now, Jesus comes into the room. What do? Jump up and, hey, Jesus, I don't think so. My eyes would be on the floor, I think. What is he going to say to us? How will he react to us? And instead of upbraiding him, he comes in and says, peace be with you. More outpouring of his mercy. And Thomas, who's not there, and he says, I won't believe unless I can see and touch for myself. And you can imagine Jesus might say, Thomas, how are people after you going to believe? They're not going to be able to see. They're going to have to believe on your word. You can't take the word of your brother apostle. No. He says, Thomas, I'll do anything for you to believe. Go ahead. Put your finger in this hole. Put your hand in my side. Nothing but mercy coming from Jesus. And he gives them the power to absolve from sins. More mercy outflowing. He gives the Eucharist, that his sacrifice can be continued. More mercy. As we read this gospel and think about it, it's just more and more mercy. It never stops flowing. And so there are 2 things I want to say to you. First, as regards to sin. There is no sin greater than God's mercy. There is no number of sins done greater than God's mercy. And those are 2 things I hear. I've heard for 20 years. Okay, so why haven't you been to confession church? It was just so terrible what I did. I just couldn't come in. Or I confess the same thing all the time. I know God's tired of hearing me say this. God's not tired of hearing you say it. There's mercy. No sin too great. You can't do something. Now, and I know you know this, but just for the sake of it, I'm not encouraging you to sin with abandon. Don't worry about your sin. That's not what I'm saying. But there is no sin greater than God's mercy. It doesn't matter how many times. If you want to turn from that sin, come. That's what he gave us, the sacrament of reconciliation. But the second thing is mercy is not just for our sins, but we see the reason for God's mercy is to continue to gather people. God never stops trying to draw us to Him. God never stops trying to comfort us, to bring us through our suffering, grief, and whatever else, to keep us close to Him. And so apply God's mercy to that as well. Beg for God's mercy if you're sick or ill or grieving or sad, worried, anxious, or someone you know is. And later on, we'll have somebody talk about that aspect of God's mercy. But we're leaving with this. God's mercy never ends. It's unmeasurable. And even though we don't understand it, we don't have to understand God's mercy to benefit from it. All we need for God's mercy is to ask for it, is to need it. God's mercy is unfathomable. So there's no way ever to exhaust it. So never despair that God would have mercy on you, for you, in any situation, any way, any time, anywhere.